this is still largely considered the best racing movie, the best car movie ever made. And really the question is why? What happened here? I mean, this did win some Academy, this is actually Academy Award winning. This was best sound mixing, best sound editing, best film editing, which interestingly Ford versus Ferrari also won best sound editing and best film editing just this week or so ago. But really one of the, why was this so good and what was it that made it work? And really this film did some technical things that had never been done before. That's really the big difference. Most of the time, if you saw 50s, 60s films, most of the time it's a driver in front of a steering wheel and they're projecting the video behind him. So it's all very fake and he has to act like he's driving the car, which never works. Just never works. And in this case, the reason this works is these are real cars driven at real speeds. And for the most part, what you will see are real drivers driving the cars. We start talking about, there'll be some scenes in here where you see a lot of the racing drivers sitting around, they're having a meeting, right? And if we were to stop the film and go around the room, every one of those people in that scene was a current Grand Prix or Le Mans driver at that time. So it's, when you look around, or retired I should say actually, because when you look around the room, you'll see Dan Gurney sitting down right in front. You'll see Phil Hill, you'll see Richie Ginther, you'll see Fangio sitting in the back of the room. People like that, legendary names who John Frankenheimer got to participate in the film, use them as consultants, and actually drive the car. So when you see the cars going around the racetrack, they're being driven at real speeds by people that actually know what they're doing. And that was, until this point, that really hadn't happened. One of the other things, and as we start to get into some of the pictures here, is the technical challenge of mounting a 40-some pound Panavision 70mm camera on a little flimsy 1,000-pound race car. Mm-hmm. And especially Lotus cars in the days were known. It was, Innes Ireland told me a story one time of, they had, they had won a race and he was brought a cake for his birthday and there was a little replica of a Lotus Formula car on it. And he picked the car up and he broke the wheel off and set it back on the cake, and he said, "Now that looks correct." And they were flimsy, fragile, barely, they were lucky they didn't self-destruct right after they crossed the finish line. That's how Formula cars were built. Lightness was everything. So it was a real challenge to make all of this stuff work and not have the cameras fall off and everything else. So here, let's go to the next slide. And this is a good example of what was done. You see this gigantic structure that was adapted to the front of the car. Now he's actually going to drive that car. You'll see this is actually a little, you see the carburetors there, that's actually a little 4-cylinder, probably a Lotus 20 at this point, that they're using because again, James Garner doesn't fit in the cars. That was one of the big problems they had with this. Bill Frick was a well-known racer. He worked for the Cunningham team, if you've ever heard of Cunningham cars. And they raced at Le Mans in the 50s and that. He was their basically lead mechanic and fabricator. He was the guy that came in and came up with ways to mount all of this stuff on the car. And like I say, you see with the big film cans and all of that, these things are, that's 50 pounds worth of gear that they're hanging on the car. So, and also those are really expensive. You don't want to have that fall off and go and have to explain to the cinema rental people what just happened to their camera. So, so really this film, it's a combination of the technical aspects of what was done with the cars using real race cars, and combined with Lionel Linden, his vision of how this all wanted to look. And he was the guy that created a lot of these shots So he's the one that came up with the camera angles and things like that. So let's move to the next one. Here's a good example. This is on the side of the car. The scene you see and it's in a lot of the movie posters and that, of James Garner on the banking while the car is driving, and he's driving the car at speed, is this setup looking at him. And so you can picture also through the Monaco scene, this is, if you look in the background, this is Monaco, because you'll see the crowd and the people and all of that. And we'll get to that whole craziness in a minute. So also let's move on to the next one. One of the other keys, this is one of the reasons the film looks the way it does. That is a Ford GT40. So that's a basically 200 mile an hour capable car with great big cameras hung on both ends of it. That rear camera is actually remote controlled. So there's a passenger in the car steering the camera around with a big set of dials down in there. But they would drive this around. That's Formula One champion Phil Hill driving the car. So you got a guy who knows what he's doing, driving a car that's capable, and then they hung these giant cameras on it, and he went out, and this particular picture happens to be, I believe this one was at Monaco. This is, but they would go out, and so when you see the scenes of him following a car around, or some of the shots, and you'll see another one later where the camera's mounted low in front of the car, a lot of times that's done with this car. So this is one of the few cars they had that could keep up with the Formula One cars of the day. So here, let's go on. Yeah, go to the next one. And here's a fun little thing. Here's a little, maybe you guys don't know, this is an obscure little Screen Actors Guild rule. If you are acting, you cannot drive a car. You cannot do both. You can drive a car or you can act. You cannot do both. So how do we deal with that? We take the front of the car off and we hang it on a trailer. We make a trailer out of it. We hang it on the back of the GT40, and we go flying around at 120 miles an hour. And this sort of thing, we'd had what they call in Hollywood a process car, which is where you'll see a car sits on a trailer and the guy looks like he's driving. And basically, it's like a Ford F-350 towing this around and the camera's up in front of it. And those don't go real fast. They could go out and drive at racing speeds. And so 100 plus miles an hour, when you see the car at Monza on the banking flying around, this is how it's done. And this, again, you see the top camera, the giant motor and things underneath it, that's all remote control. That can spin and rotate and tilt the camera. You see the rear camera on it is fixed at that point. They had a bunch of different structures, and it's kind of Rube Goldberg-ish. You see all these little straps and things going everywhere. And that was a lot of Bill Frick's creations. Those were things that, it's a racer's mentality. It's like, we need to get this done. How are we going to do it? Let's figure it out. And so that's where a lot of this stuff was invented. So you see the actor is driving, quote unquote, the car there, and then the other cars are actually interacting and moving around in the scene in relation to the GT40. So these guys, there were a few stunt drivers specifically. For example, Kerry Lofton, who you probably know from Bullet, for example, and Ronnie Rondell, who's done all kinds of things over the years. Actually, one of the most things Ronnie Rondell is known for is the Pink Floyd album cover. He's the guy on Fire. So if you've never seen that, that's him. The guy does everything. So, but he's a legend. He's a real legend. One other thing I'll talk about here that when it comes to realism, one of the things that happened with this was that the Formula One is controlled by the FIA, a French organization. And then the teams, you have Ferrari, you have Lotus, you have things like that. They were originally really kind of cool to somebody coming in and making a movie about them. And so they're like, no, we don't know if we want to help you. And John Frankenheimer originally went to different organizations and they're like, I don't know. They weren't really sure. So they went, the very first scenes they did at Brands Hatch, he did just some really quick rushes, put together and sent to Enzo. Enzo Ferrari. And he saw them and was so blown away with it that he basically gave the movie carte blanche. Whatever you need, we'll help you. And so there's a scene you will see in where they're in the Ferrari factory, and they are literally in the Ferrari factory in the racing department. That's how much, and that's how enamored Enzo was with this whole thing.
Is that the Adolfo Celli scene?
Yeah, that's where they're in with the cars but yes, that's actually Ferrari. That's actually Ferrari's racing department in 1966. So. And that's the thing, you'll see in the background, a lot of these are real race cars. Now granted, what James Garner was in is a Formula Junior. It's a little 4-cylinder car that they modified because you can't cut up, a Lotus 33 was a monocoque car. You can't cut it up and make a big guy fit in it. It doesn't work that way. So they took these other cars and they adapted them for him. But a lot of the cars you'll see, in this movie are actual Formula One cars, maybe a year old or so, but they're actual racing cars from the period. And then let's go ahead and move to the next one. Here's a good example. This is how they get that speed shot. And this is something, Frankenheimer's quote, they got in there, this was apparently just like a cluster. And you can imagine you're shooting during, if you've ever seen a race on TV, you see all the crowds, all the people, that sort of thing. And they come and go, okay, we're going to stop all of this and we're going to go out and shoot a scene. That just doesn't happen. But this is actually how they did it. You can see that they have the camera mounted on the front of the car, and that's actually, I believe that's a BRM that he's driving in that picture. But that they took that out and were doing basically hot laps of the track. That's where you get that shot. And when you see the crowds in the background, that's shot on race day. They actually went out during the race. They went out during the race and did that. So all right, let's move to the next one here. And this is okay. Now this is shot at Spa. So this is a different racetrack, so the crowds aren't here. But I just want to show you, this is how they did it. There's no like speeding up the film or anything like that. This is get out, get in the cars and go. And the sort of things they did back then, and the carte blanche they had, like I say, closing down things at Monaco so they could take up, basically stopping the activity so they could go out and drive. It hadn't been done. It had never been done before. And a lot of it was kind of, the help from Enzo Ferrari and things like that, where he kind of pushed some, a little bit of his influence around and allowed this to happen. It was really difficult to do then. There's been a couple of times in history where this sort of thing has happened. Days of Thunder, not necessarily a great movie, but there's a lot of good car action in it. And it was the same thing. They entered cars in an actual race at Daytona. And they had to qualify the whole bit, and they ran the cars around in the race, in the actual racing scenes with cameras mounted in them. And would, instead of, everyone else would pit in 15 seconds for tires and fuel and things like that, they would stop and it was 30 minutes for a film change or a camera change. So, but it's really rare and it's really difficult to do. It's really difficult to do. But let's go on to the next one here. No, go ahead. And this, I love this quote from John Frankenheimer. It's like, somebody gives you $10.5 million, go have fun. And it's one of those things. What if you were a Ferrari driver? And that's an actual Ferrari F1 car in that picture. And you'll see this scene in the movie, and they're full speed. These guys are going for it. And so, but this is just an amazing indulgent fantasy. That's really what this movie comes down to. And then I wanted to end with this. This was, James Garner's kind of one of my heroes anyway. But This is a quote. This is a quote from him. It's like you feel like you have actually been there. Now this car, just to be really kind of technical and stuff here, if you look at this, you see all the cam covers and the intakes and things. That's all fake. Yeah. That's all fake. There's a little 4-cylinder engine under all of that that's wheezing away to get him out there. But also you'll notice there's no seat in the car. You see it's bare metal. That's the gas tank that he's basically sitting on. He was, yeah, you don't stay in the car for very long when you do these shots. You know, but yeah, it really, to this day, like I say, you'll have some people nowadays that might argue that Ford versus Ferrari may be better. And how many people have seen that, just for a reference? Okay, so we got a few people have seen that. And I think it's, Ford versus Ferrari is maybe a better character piece than this. This still, to me, is some of the greatest racing footage that's ever been put in a film, and because they actually did this during a race, and so it was actually shot, you know, live. But yeah, and again, I'll touch briefly, just going back. Again, when you see a lot of the scenes here, you will see that they actually use actual racing footage in a lot of these films. So some of the helmets and things you'll see, if you know racing history, you'll recognize. The paint job on that helmet was Chris Amons, who's a New Zealander. The Brian Bedford character has the tartan stripe, which was Jackie Stewart. Because to be honest, Brian Bedford couldn't drive his way out of a paper bag. He couldn't drive a stick shift car at all. So in this,
before this movie at all.
he could not drive. He couldn't drive a car. And so literally in this, pretty much anytime you see the car moving, it's actually Jackie Stewart driving it. You know, he was completely hopeless as a driver. Now James Garner, on the other hand, did go on after this film. This is really what kind of set the seed for him. He went on, did some racing himself, decided he was a better team owner and manager than he was actually a driver, and went on to form what was called American International Racing, and raced at Daytona. Mainly it went to endurance racing, sports cars, things like that. Raced Can-Am in the late, like 68 through 70, I believe. With his team there. So was very, very involved in motorsports, but kind of more as like a team owner manager type of person. He was a contemporary to, if you think of Carroll Shelby at the time. Shelby had his team, Dan Gurney had All-American Racers, which was originally Shelby and Gurney together. Then those split up, and then you had James Garner, who was the other kind of big American racing team.
So I just want to thank
Yes.
you for.
I'll be back for Le Mans. That's one of my other favorites. I will definitely be back.